art for me started about 40 years ago when my wife and I opened a jewelry store in Old Town Auburn. This is after 15 years working in electronics, always wanting to be an artist. So Jan and I became goldsmiths and had the jewelry store there in Old Town for 30 years. And we retired 10 or 12 years ago. And looking forward to a new medium, I discovered clay 9 years ago and have just thrown myself into it and love the medium, and I'm having a great time. And this piece is all about the texture, and the first piece I did with this texture, I'm a slab builder, and everything I do is starts with a flat slab of wet clay as opposed to working on the wheel. So I roll the clay out flat, cut a rectangle, form it into a sleeve or a tube, put a bottom on it, and you have a piece. So this piece is about this texture, which I did with I made myself basically like a rolling pin, about so big around and so wide, with an axle in it. And I glued sharp gravel to the surface on that rolling pin. So I can roll the clay out, take that big gnarly rolling pin and roll it in the clay and get this really beautiful texture. It can be light or it can be heavy. And that's how this piece physically was formed. And then the glazing, I painted into the pits with copper carbonate and sprayed this off-white glaze over it. So when it's fired up to 2,000 degrees, some of that copper carbonate bleeds into the white glaze, giving you this beautiful green tinging and the dark shadowing. And that's how that piece came to be. The title of this piece is Time is Telling. Looks like it's seen its days. This is the second piece I ever made. And I saw the possibilities of the sharp gravel texture. When I made this piece, I rolled my clay out and wrapped it around a styrofoam block, took it out in my driveway and slammed it down into the gravel on all sides, and picked the gravel out and took that clay and formed the piece. And this piece was wood fired, which makes the finish on it really dark. But this is called Rocky Road, named for my gravel driveway. And that's how we got the texture. My wife put this on, and makes a nice addition to that piece. And I can switch to this one. Here's another newer piece made with that same gravel tool. Again, pressing a little more heavy down on the bottom. And I painted red iron oxide in the pits on this piece and sprayed on this pumpkin colored glaze. And the iron oxide blends and melts and flows right out into the glaze and brings up this reddish color that's on the bottom of it. I lined the inside of the piece with a light kind of an off-white glaze, and the two melt together up here on the edge. Here's another gravel piece. And again, I've used heavy application of copper carbonate on the gravel, the chewed up gravel portion of it. Brings out that bits of green. And I had fun putting a lip on this with the heavy clay that I raked with a comb to get the striated parallel lines. That was a fun piece to do. Without working on the wheel, I make a bowl out of a slab of clay, starting with an 18-inch circle of clay, cutting out 6 about pie-sized pieces or equally around the edge, and I bring those seams up and close them like this, and I end up with a crude bowl about this big around and about this tall. And I place that on a little turning wheel, a table, and work with a smooth river rock in my left hand and a wooden paddle in my right hand, and hold that in there and just go around and around and around, paddling the clay over that stone with the wooden paddle. It's a meditation I love to do, and that's how the actual form of the bowl is done, by forming the clay over that rock. After I have the form, I love to carve. When the clay dries a bit, and it's what we call leather hard, I carve into the clay with a whole variety of small carving tools and carve a three-dimensional form, the flower and lily pads on this side. And after the piece is totally dry, it's bisque fired in the kiln one time up to about 1800 degrees. And then most of my glazes are sprayed on. So I spray on the glaze and fire it again up to about 2200 degrees. And it's hard and waterproof and very durable. So this is 5 of cones, and I had a lot of fun making this piece. It was a challenge to make these cones and assemble them and get them dried safely and fired. So I fired this twice. Bisque fired it and then glaze fired it, all with just the raw clay. After glaze firing, I covered it in 23 karat gold leaf, and it was a lot of fun to do, and I'm really pleased the way it came out. And being a retired goldsmith, I just couldn't help myself. I couldn't stop myself and did the gold leafing on it. Here's another piece with a lot of carving. This piece took 2 weeks to carve and 2 months to dry. I had to wrap it in saran wrap, leaving the top open, and set it on sheetrock, which very slowly will pull the moisture out of the piece. Wrapped in saran wrap to prevent it from cracking where you have really thin connections like this. If it dries too fast, you'll get a lot of cracking in there. So like 2.5 months to make a piece like this. That was the first filigree piece I carved, and I look forward to getting back and doing more of that. A couple blocks from where I had the jewelry store was a fella who works in the ceramics department at Sierra College. And after I retired, I happened to wander into his studio on a studio tour weekend. And I said, well, I always wanted to try clay someday. And he said, well, get in here Saturday and we'll get you started. Turns out he does a 3-hour class every Saturday for $20. So I said, count me in, I'll give it a try. So the first day I showed up, he pulls out a ball of clay about so big, and he slammed it down on the concrete floor. And he said, I like to use my biggest muscle group for this step. So he gets on there with his shoes on and stamped it all out into a big pancake about this big. And he said, this is how we do it. So he flops that on the table, and he cut out a rectangle, and he said, this is how we close it up and make a sleeve, and stands it on the table, and then we put a bottom on it. And looking at the clay, here's bits of orange and bark and rocks stuck in the clay. And so I kind of pulled those things out, and he said, well, there you go. See what you can do with that. So I just started pushing and pulling and twisting the form, and ended up with a piece that I wood fired, that I'm very fond of. And I knew immediately that this was for me. Clay was a medium for me, and I was going to get serious about it, which I did. And I'm into my 9th year now and love it, and really missed the studio when we were in transition, moving over here to the coast. And I'm so thrilled now to have a new studio up and running.